Good morning and welcome today to your GCSE History walkthrough for question 3 of the USA topic. So like with all our questions, what we need to do is we need to make sure we are understanding what the question is asking us about. So question 3 is on the screen, and first of all we have to just read it. So question 3 asks us, which interpretation gives the more convincing opinion about immigrants in America in the 1920s? Explain your answer based on your contextual knowledge and what it says in interpretation A and B. So what's really important here is that I know straight away if I'm seeing this word convincing, I know it means truthful. So which is more truthful? I need to be able to remember that. But after I've read it and I know what convincing means, I need to ask myself, what is this question asking me, or what part of history is this question asking me about the USA topic? And it's asking me about immigrants in America in the 1920s. And again, as I've already pointed out, it's asking me about the fact that is it convincing, and it's asking me about which interpretation. So it's asking about the convincingness of the interpretation. The bit below actually tells me how we go about answering this and what I need to include. So I can see straight away I need to include interpretations A and B, and I also need to include contextual knowledge. And by now you should know that your contextual knowledge is your own knowledge, which you get from your book, but you won't have your book in your exam, so you get it from your brain. And also that this exam is 8 marks, which means we should roughly be spending on this around 10 minutes. Now, the way we answer this is we know we need to use A and B, and we know we need to talk about the fact, is it being truthful about immigrants in America in the 1920s? So we know from our interpretations that 3 is also about what they do in the box. So also what it says in the box, just as 1 was. So we need to pick out a quote from here. So I know from A and B, I'm going to need to pick out a quote, and then I'm going to need to use my own knowledge. So I need a quote about is convincing or not convincing about immigrants in America. I could use the one that I've already highlighted for question 1 and use that again if I've got good own knowledge for it, or I could use a different one, and it's exactly the same for interpretation B as well. I may also want to pick out something that isn't convincing or as convincing. So where I put truthful here, I might also want to think if it is not truthful or less convincing. So in this case, I've just decided to make things a little bit more tricky for myself and not use the green quote, because I can't think of any own knowledge that shows immigrants not appreciating great achievements. But I'm going to pick this one here. They're waiting for the chance to replace the stars and stripes with the red flag of communism. And I'm thinking now, well, what do I know about that? Well, I might just add some detail about Sacco and Vanzetti. Okay, I might add some ideas about capitalism v communism. And I'm just going to do the same for interpretation B. So I want to find out, quote, immigrants taking pride in how quickly they've become part of American society. So what do I know about this? So I might talk about, for example, the Palmer raids. I might talk about Little Italy, and whether this shows the quote to be truthful or false, or not as truthful, less convincing. So let's start by having a look at how we get half marks on this question. So to get half marks on this question, we need to start off by talking about A. So I've talked about A and said they are only waiting for the chance to replace stars and stripes with the red flag of communism. So I've used a quote here. Now if I just write a quote, I'm going to get 0 marks. However, what I need to do now is use my own knowledge. But I also need to link it to the question. So remember, the question is asking me about immigrants in the 1920s. So is this true or false about immigrants in the 1920s, that they were just waiting to basically make America communist? And I've said, well, I know it's convincing. That's my answer. I know it's truthful. And now I need to back that up with some of my own knowledge. And I've said, well, some of the immigrants were communist, and some would have disliked America as America was capitalist. These ideas were different, as capitalism is about keeping the wealth, whilst communism is about giving it away. So this would pretty much get me 3 marks. I've used a little bit of detail. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double tick in red for the detail. So 1 tick is detail, 2 tick is specific detail. So for example, I've got immigrants were communist. Well, it says some immigrants were communist, so that's detail. To take that further, I need to say what type of immigrants, do we have an example of that? And some, whereas America was capitalist. Capitalism is about keeping the wealth, communism is about giving it away. So I've used detail there, I'm happy. And I've just done exactly the same with B. I'm just telling the marker what I know. Well, I know that B says that immigrants take pride in how quickly they've become part of American society. I then said that this isn't convincing. So this isn't truthful. It's not truthful that that immigrants take pride in how quickly they become part of American society. What knowledge do I have to back up with that? Well, big groups of immigrants, such as Italians, kept to themselves and created their own area in New York. I also know some immigrants were illegal. I also know that some immigrants were picked on, like Sacco and Vanzetti, and the ones arrested for communism in the Palmer raids. So again, I've said why it's not truthful. I've actually used some very specific detail here about big groups of immigrants such as Italians keeping to themselves and owning their own area in New York. I also know some immigrants were illegal, which they were. Now, this bit here is a little bit irrelevant, and the reason why I've done this is to show you that you always have to link it with your quotes. You're saying that something is not truthful. You're saying that immigrants taking pride in that they take pride in becoming Americans quickly. The fact that immigrants were picked on, that has nothing to do with your quote, so you don't really get any marks for this. So when I look it up, it's a quote and a couple of pieces of own knowledge for each. That is going to get you your half marks. Very, very simple, 4 out of 8, and I know you can all do that. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different that I've not done with question 1 and 2 yet, but I'm going to show you what a level 3 looks like, a 5 to 6 marks, a 6 marks really. Now for this question, this is what I would advise everyone who even wants an 8 or 9 grade. If you can get 6 marks on this, you'll be still looking at 8 and 9 if you do well on the other questions. So the 6 marks is really, really important here. So again, I'm going to read through, and it says A is somewhat convincing about immigrants because it says they're only waiting for the chance to replace stars and stripes with the red flag of communism. So I've said A is talking about the fact that immigrants are only waiting for the chance to replace stars and stripes with the red flag of communism. And I've said this is somewhat convincing. Now that tells the reader, the marker, that you agree but you also disagree with this. And I've gone on to say, well, there is some truth here, as some Eastern Europeans, and now I need to back it up, some Eastern European immigrants were communist, and some would likely have resented the capitalist economy of America, so wanted to convert America to communism. But then I've talked about however. I then said, well, yeah, there is some truth, but actually it's not fully true. And I said that the actual quote doesn't take into account the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came into America, actively engaged in American society, with areas such as Little Italy in New York contributing to the economic boom. Now again, what's good about this answer, and this by doing this alone would get me 4 out of 8 marks, would be the following. And I'm going to put 1 tick on the side for detail and 2 ticks for specific detail. So as you can see here, it's the level of detail. I said there's somewhat convincing. Well, what is convincing about this? Eastern European immigrants were communist, resented the capitalist economy of America, so wanted to convert Americans to communism. The fact that it's also arguing against itself and it's still sticking to somewhat. If you've just said it's convincing, you need to back up why it's convincing, but you said it's somewhat, so why it also isn't convincing, and vice versa. So why isn't this convincing? Well, we know that hundreds of thousands of immigrants came into America. They actively engaged in American society, such as Little Italy in New York, which contributed to the economic boom. So again, this on its own, this paragraph, would get me 4 out of 8 marks. And then I'd move on to B. And it's just the same. I've said B is equally as convincing as A. And why is that? Why is it somewhat convincing? Because it says immigrants take pride in how quickly they become part of American society. So why is it true that those Americans are proud of themselves? Well, it's true because immigrants opened businesses in America after being given loans by banks, contributing to the economic success. Economic boom, sorry. However, B does not take into account the unwillingness of immigrants to integrate. Do we have an example of this? Well, yes, we do. Sacco and Vanzetti, although innocent, were anarchists who believed in no government. This was completely against American values, who firmly believe in government through the federal and state government. So again, you can see that here I've kind of argued, I've said that it's a little bit convincing, but there's bits that aren't convincing. Now, I'm not going to give myself any ticks here for detail because I've kind of repeated what it says in the first paragraph and you can't really do that. However, B does not take into account the unwillingness of immigrants to integrate. We've got an example of Sacco and Vanzetti. They were anarchists who believed in no government. It's against American values. How do we know it's against American values? They believed in the government. What type of government? Federal and state. So even that level of detail there, that's going to get me 6 out of 8 marks. I also just wanted to highlight what's different between the level 2 paragraph here and the level 3 one we're looking at now. So the level 2 one previously and the level 3 one we're looking at now is that the knowledge follows on from each other. So for example, here, B does not take into account the unwillingness of immigrants to integrate. How do we know? So how do we know they're unwilling? Well, Sacco and Vanzetti. Who were Sacco and Vanzetti? They were anarchists. So what? This is completely against American values, who firmly believe in a government. What type of government? Federal and state. So again, you can see the underlining as I go to answer my question. Now, what I'm going to do here is going to show you how to get your 7 and 8 marks on this answer. I would say that if you've done 2 paragraphs in 10 minutes, I would say move on. You do not need to do a conclusion. Sacrifice those minutes on another question, on that 12 marker at the end, to get a good mark on that. 2 marks if you go over 10 minutes is not worth it, because a lot of people don't do the 2 paragraphs well enough and then waste time on adding a conclusion. So I would say only if you're extremely confident you're hitting that level 3 that you should attempt to do this. And the answer is exactly the same as the one I've just shown you, but there is a small conclusion added to the end. And what's really important here is that in a conclusion you sum up what you've said. So in your answer you said that A is somewhat convincing and B is equally as convincing as A. So basically they're both the same in terms of how convincing they are. There's things that are convincing, there's things that aren't. So you need to basically say the same in your conclusion. So overall, both interpretations are only somewhat convincing. And then you basically say, well, why is that? Why are they only somewhat convincing? And I've said, mainly due to both interpretations making general statements that do not take into account that immigrants are individuals and should not be tarnished as one individual group. Again, a very high level skill, just basically saying that these immigrants have been grouped together, they're not being taken as individual people, and that shouldn't happen, and that you can't just say all immigrants are bad because of a couple of examples, or you can't say all immigrants are good because of a couple of examples. A very high level skill that I would be saying, try if you feel like you've got these 2 paragraphs down, excellent. However, if you reach 10 minutes and you're up to this point, move on. I would also say, do not do a level 2 paragraph, which is this one, and a level 2 paragraph, which is this one, and then try and do a conclusion, because you will pick up no marks at the conclusion and it will stay in 4 out of 8 marks. That is a very common mistake to make.